Today we will be discussing the efficacy of anti-discrimination laws in the United States as related to sex, gender, and sexuality. Welcome to the show.
Hey everybody.
So, as the guest today, I would like you to, you've put together a formal outline, and you have a case to make, so why don't you just take the reins here and talk about the issue.
Yeah, the United States has a long and sordid history of discrimination and anti-discrimination laws ever since the founding, prior to the founding even. And up until really the Civil War, any sort of anti-discrimination laws were handled at a local and state level, as that was their jurisdiction. The federal government did not have jurisdiction up until really what are called the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. And basically these laws were handled at the like I said, the state level. The civil rights cases in 1883 was the first example of a federal law that tried to be passed, and the Supreme Court struck that down because they tried to use the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, to say that states are not allowed to, or private businesses rather, are not allowed to discriminate based on race or gender. Of course, sexual orientation wasn't in the mainstream at the time, so that wasn't included. But the Supreme Court struck it down, saying that the Congress had no ability to, basically the 14th Amendment only applied to states and not private businesses. So it really wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or even Brown versus Board of Education prior to that, that the federal government asserted itself in anti-discrimination laws. And then you saw that from there a buildup of more congressional acts regarding anti-discrimination, such as the Equal Rights Amendment, which of course was defeated in the 70s, and it still floats around today, but it never really got any ground.
I just wanted to interrupt there for a second when you mentioned the history of the federal government regarding anti-discrimination laws. Is there any kind of a background or a precedent of the state level for anti-discrimination laws during that period of time?
Prior to the Civil War, or?
Before the 1960s, when this took off at the federal level.
Yeah, prior to the Civil War, people have this perception that the North, prior to the Civil War, was some bastion of freedom and liberty for, of course, at the time, just, black people, but that actually was not the case. The North was equally as racist as people perceived the South to be. So after the Civil War, you actually had a slow buildup of local and state statutes and ordinances that did allow for or force anti-discrimination, but it really wasn't widespread.
Okay. I was just curious on that background. I thought some other people may be.
I'm sorry. Well, and of course we're all familiar with Jim Crow, which was a Southern phenomenon, but it's important to note that Jim Crow laws were exactly that, laws. It wasn't private businesses that were choosing to discriminate. This is laws that forced private businesses to discriminate.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that if you want to continue that.
Sure. It's the what you have now is basically the modern anti-discrimination movement is focused on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgenders, or LGBT. And it really didn't pick up movement until, I think it didn't become in the sort of the mainstream consciousness until 2015. Indiana, the state of Indiana, passed what they called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and it basically states that a government entity may not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, and it was feared that this law would allow private businesses to not serve LGBT individuals. So an example was given at the time of a pizza place who chose not to serve a gay individual because of his sexual orientation, obviously, and using the religious excuse. However, it was shortly after that the law was amended to basically protect LGBT individuals from discrimination, although critics say it still isn't enough. But there are a lot of states that have extended protections for LGBT, and Indiana is now one of them. So that was a big thing. There was a lot of boycotts surrounding Indiana. States would not allow their employees to travel there, and I know the NBA, which is obviously very big in Indiana, was threatening to boycott, and there was a lot of boycotts of Indiana, and still to this day I think there are some, but it kind of went away with that amendment. Did you have anything to
No,
add?
I thank you for framing the historic background there. So going forward from the history, where are we now after painting this picture? So we really see the federal government getting involved in the 1960s and moving forward into the present. Obviously, LGBT rights, very big issue at the state and federal level. So what's the atmosphere right now beyond the history?
Well, the atmosphere, I mean, it's framed in terms of how it was always framed in regard to race or gender, where it's an issue of, some people describe it as an issue of human rights, some people describe it as an issue of constitutional rights. Of course, with the basically same-sex marriage ruling last year, was it, in the Supreme Court, basically saying that same-sex marriage is a protected constitutional right. There's an even greater push to include LGBT, because LGBT is not covered under the Civil Rights Act directly, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So there's an effort to not even amend the law. I mean, we're not talking about adding this or redoing the law. It's just to say, well, they're covered, even if they're not actually addressed in the Civil Rights Act. So it's getting a lot of coverage, and from the mainstream media, of course, especially recently with the North Carolina Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act, which most of us are probably familiar with, at least on a basic level. So now it's being framed in terms of human rights and constitutional rights.
Right, absolutely. And I think that a lot of viewers will agree that it's been a big part of mainstream media recently, especially in the past couple of years. So regarding the efficacy of these laws, what is your case to be made here as far as the federal government and the state governments and local governments and business, and how should these forces work together regarding discrimination, regarding anti-discrimination laws, and how to essentially include LGBT people into the market?
Well, the thing is there's a lot of sort of back and forth with, I mean, you have to look at it in two ways. You have to look at it in terms of what is lawful or legal, and just sort of what should or shouldn't happen. And from the standpoint of a legal standpoint, I think there's a lot of mixed messages floating around out there. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed under the guise of the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Because, like I said, the previous civil rights, well, actually, there's been numerous civil rights acts that have been passed, but on the magnitude of the one passed in 1964, the one that the Supreme Court struck down in 1883 was on the guise of the 14th Amendment. However, because the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment can't be used to basically ban private businesses from anti-discrimination, the Congress in 1964 had to use the Commerce Clause. And the Supreme Court has since then basically said the Supreme Court has given Congress a lot of leeway in what it can and can't regulate with the Commerce Clause, and there's a lot of mixed messages on what exactly it can. In 1995, in the case United States versus Lopez, the Supreme Court reined in a little bit of Commerce Clause power, but basically the Supreme Court has upheld that, restaurants, hotels, movie theaters, which they view as serving, interstate customers, so to speak, and provide public accommodations, quote unquote, that they can be regulated under the Commerce Clause. But, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so it sounds, from the legal perspective, it sounds like what a lot of us have come to know and recognize goes on essentially is there's a balance of loopholes, politics, complex and convoluted stipulations here and there as to try to perhaps change law around previous precedents in the legal system to fit the political climate. Would that be accurate?
I believe so. I think that is accurate. Because I keep referring to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because it is such a landmark case, and I'll get into why even more so soon. But the Civil Rights Act is basically used as a catch-all for anything, and the courts, depending on what the individual justice's preference is and their personal preference for what should or shouldn't be law, is certainly added in. Because if you think about it, if you're going to say that, a restaurant qualifies as interstate commerce, whether they're on the interstate and they serve, multiple, peoples from different states, which I think was the original intention, is that, restaurants next to the interstate serve interstate commerce. But that now applies to all restaurants.
And now, I just want to, for the clarification of people who may not know, could you explain just briefly why it's so significant that the federal government would classify a restaurant underneath the Interstate Commerce Clause?
Well, there was a Supreme Court case, I believe it was later that year in 1964. It was in the late 60s, and I apologize, I don't have that case offhand, but it was decided that there was a restaurant near the interstate, interstate, and it refused to serve, black people. And so the Supreme Court said they had to, because that restaurant could serve people who were passing through from one state to another, and maybe they just stopped there to eat, but they were passing through. So they determined that Congress has the power to tell that business that it had to serve to anybody, because that is regulating interstate commerce.
Right, and that's really what I was hinting at there. So for people who may not know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the federal government is specifically in the Constitution outlined to regulate interstate commerce. Is that correct?
That is correct. It is one of their few powers in Article 1, Section 8 that the federal government does have jurisdiction over. But like pretty much anything in 2016, anything is up for interpretation in the Constitution, and it really doesn't matter what the original intent was or the original meaning of the words were. It's just up for speculation or interpretation based on one's political leanings, whether they're on the left or the right. So
this is essentially, discrimination aside, I don't think anybody is really making the argument for mistreating people, but just looking at the precedent that it sets, we're talking about, or you could make the argument rather that it's a kind of a creeping expansion of the federal government subverting states' rights.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not sure if states' rights is the proper term for it. I know that I've used that term in the past, but I look at it more as a jurisdiction issue where at the founding, the federal government had specific jurisdiction, which is outlined in Article 1, Section 8, and there were specific jurisdictions left to the states. The states, of course, cannot print their own money. That is outlined in the Constitution, but the Ninth and 10th Amendment make it clear that what is not outlined in Article 1, Section 8 is specifically the jurisdiction of the states. And because, policing whether a restaurant serves a gay person or not is not listed in Article 1, Section 8, we see that, it is clearly the jurisdiction of the states. However, that is an originalist sort of way to look at the Constitution, and I know that is not in vogue at this time, but that all goes back to sort of how you interpret the Constitution.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to set that down for anybody who may not be acquainted with the Constitution and the history of these kinds of laws. So where were you going to pick up from? I'm sorry if I digressed a bit there.
No, that's perfectly fine. So you have these two aspects, like I said, of what the law says and what it should be, and even the law itself is confused, and I think that goes into a greater topic for another day about the purpose of law and how the U.S. court system is confused itself on what law is. But take, for instance, the case was a year or two ago, the cake baker, famous thing.
Yes, I remember that one.
Yes, in New Mexico, and she refused to bake a cake for a gay wedding, and it went to the New Mexico Supreme Court, and they ruled that her right to free speech was not violated, or it didn't mention freedom of association or anything, but her rights of free speech were not violated because she was not putting words on the cake. So therefore, it was not a matter of speech. But at the same time, one could argue that the act of baking a cake is art, and is art not protected from speech, or as speech? And you could also make the case of, if isn't freedom of speech the freedom of not saying anything just as much as saying anything? So I think the court system is confused. I think there are contradictory policies and rulings all over the place, and I think it really does just go on the whims of the justices at the time.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you were done with that statement.
Oh, no, I am done with that. The other issue is what preferences are for the public, so going away from the law portion of it. The preferences of the public that's kind of trickier to deal with, even more so, because you have certain states like North Carolina, which has been in the news this year recently, for, like I said, their Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act. And this is interesting because it's gotten a lot, I think more so, heat than Indiana. And clearly the legislature in North Carolina and the governor wanted this, and if you're going to go based off of sort of the democratic republic system we have, then their constituents in North Carolina also want this. So basically what that does is, there was a Charlotte, North Carolina passed an ordinance that said that any businesses in the city had to allow people to use the bathrooms in which gender they identify with. And so the legislature in North Carolina passed a bill that said that not only said that all government in or government facilities in the state, people had to use the bathroom based on the gender on their birth certificate, but it also removed the ability for localities and cities to make their own laws. So basically, the only discrimination or anti-discrimination laws on the books are the state's laws instead of local laws.
Interesting. So you can see how these laws can, depending on who has the majority of control of power, can be either beneficial or detrimental to the LGBT community. It's not a matter so much of if it's quote unquote progressive or not. It really comes down to, I think that you were touching on just a minute ago, the difference between law and legal precedent and what the majority of the people want at that moment.
Well, that's right. And I'm always of the mind that local control is always better. So as much as I disagree with the law or the ordinance that the city of Charlotte passed, I would much rather see them pass an ordinance than the state pass a law, and I would rather see the state pass a law than the federal government. I think the more local control we get, the easier it is to change the law based on the preferences of the individuals residing in that locality. But like I said, you have to look at it from a democratic standpoint, and we won't know until, maybe this November, whether the people of North Carolina really disagree with that law based on how they, vote out incumbents. But right now, based on the way, our system is set up, you have to kind of say that their preference is to have this law. But what's interesting is, and this just came out a day or two ago, that the Justice Department has threatened North Carolina and said that the law is in violation of Title VII and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. And if they don't basically reverse the law, then they will lose federal money. And that's pretty unprecedented that the Justice Department threatens a state in regards to this.
Not just threatens, but blackmails, it would seem.
Well, I think that's right. But it's not the first time that Obama's Justice Department has done this sort of thing. Actually, in 2014, the U.S. Education Department's Office for Civil Rights released an updated guideline to the Title IX in the Civil Rights Law. And what's interesting about that is there was no amendment from Congress on the law. It was just basically the executive branch of the federal government reinterpreting a law that included sexual orientation in the Civil Rights Act. And of course, we're not sure if that's legally binding yet, but they are using it to threaten school districts. Because Title IX of the Civil Rights Act said that schools and government universities, they had to provide equal protections for genders, and the Education Department reinterpreted that to include sexual orientation.
Okay, interesting. The executive branch reinterpreting the law there in that instance. Also, another interesting point is that you're essentially making the case for local autonomy. You're saying, if I'm putting words in your mouth, correct me, but that the townships or the counties or the cities, the local municipalities, should make their own laws based on their constituents, on their voters, and that almost this statewide bathroom law is subverting the local autonomy, is creating friction where it need not be. And interestingly enough, then the federal government comes in and does the exact same thing, and they assert themselves over the state. So you have this cascade of central power. First it's the state saying you must use these bathrooms in this way, and then the federal government says no, you must not use these bathrooms in this way. And at the very bottom of this, you have the people who are actually the most likely to have to deal with this issue are not actually being able to regulate their own communities.
Well, that's right. And the way that the United States, or these United States, was set up was sort of a duality of jurisdiction, where the federal government has its jurisdiction and then the states have their jurisdiction. And it wasn't really until 1913 when we saw the, what was it, Amendment 17, I believe, that that changed it from, it was the direct election of U.S. senators. So prior to 1913, each state's legislature would determine and elect and nominate senators. And after that amendment passed, the states basically lost a lot of bargaining power with the federal government. I mean, right now we see each state as essentially an administrator for the federal government rather than individual jurisdictions. So on one hand, I think that North Carolina has every constitutional right to do this. On the other hand, I would not support that law simply because I'm for much more local autonomy.
Okay, and getting to that, what is in a more ideal system of getting back to the efficacy of the discrimination laws, just discrimination laws in general, take back from the states, the local regulations, and the federal regulations, what would you advocate as a better system to handle discrimination and anti-discrimination issues?
Well, I don't advocate a system at all, and I think that's the point. Is a system, a system implies that things should be the way, a certain way, but I don't know how things should be in a free society. So the free market, I think, can sort these matters out through a system of market forces. So, for instance,
before you go into that, I just want to define, when you say free market, you're not talking about the kind of system that we have in place now, correct? You're talking about a completely non-regulated, government does not intervene in personal and private transactions. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I appreciate you clarifying that, because there is a lot of misconceptions regarding the market. I mean, the market, the market in the United States hasn't really been. There's never been a true free market ever, but we came pretty close in like the 1800s in U.S. history. But really, ever since sort of the quote-unquote progressive era of the early 1900s, has the free market been slowly eroded. So a free market does not have regulations pro or con to businesses. There's no statute that regulates what a business can and can't do, and there's no protections. Right now we see corporations are protected in many ways by government, often at the expense of small business. That's not a free market. And people often confuse what we have now as a free market. And I appreciate you clarifying that.
Yes, certainly. I think that a lot of people will have some immediate knee-jerk reactions to that, though, in the cases of discrimination. Many people are probably going to be concerned that in a system with no regulation, that businesses will be able to discriminate and would discriminate against people unnecessarily. Could you respond to perhaps that kind of a criticism?
Well, sure, and I think it's important to point out that, well, first of all, if you look at it from a constitutional standpoint, the Constitution itself discriminates. It's right there. It's, you have to be 35 years old to run for president. That in and of itself is discriminatory. So why is it 35? I mean, it seems kind of arbitrary. So the Constitution, it has discrimination built in. But with that said, it's certainly reasonable to be, afraid of that. But we all discriminate on a daily basis. In fact, we see that with the Indiana Religious Freedom Restoration Act. We see it now with the North Carolina Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act, where you have musicians. I mean, Bruce Springsteen, Pearl Jam, The NBA has threatened to actually these musicians have boycotted, and the NBA has threatened to boycott these states. So what you're doing is you are discriminating yourself. You don't want to play, and it's actually kind of in a twisted way even worse, because these musicians are discriminating against people who had nothing to do with the law. They're not discriminating against the people who passed the law and signed into the law. They're discriminating against people who had nothing to do with it. But they're saying, I don't like what's going on here, so I'm not going to bring my business, which is perfectly legitimate. It's freedom of association. They are free to associate with the people that they agree with, and they're free to not associate with the people they don't agree with. But what's ironic about the boycott is that these people, I mean, what's the difference between somebody refusing to bake a cake for somebody that they disagree with and a musician refusing to play for people that they disagree with? And one is celebrated and the other is shunned. So and I think a boycott is a legitimate use of one's time and resources in a free market. So you have the boycott mechanism. Otherwise, from an employer standpoint, I mean, people are worried about people not, if I'm an employer, people are worried that let's say, don't like gay people. They're worried that I won't hire somebody because they're gay. Well, let's break this down, because first of all, people want to know whether I like or don't like gay people. I mean, that's important to me. I want to know if an employer is sexist. I want to know if they're racist, and I won't be able to know if they're not allowed to openly discriminate. So
I see where you're going with that. So just a quick digression. In other words, you're arguing that by making these things, making discrimination more open and making it legal, that you can openly discriminate, then you'll know specifically who the sexist people are, who the racist people are, because they're not going to feel threatened by the government or by law, so it's going to be obvious and you can avoid them. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it gives you the necessary information that you need to make educated choices and decisions in a free market. When the government gets involved, you lack the information you need to make an intelligent choice in the marketplace. So, yeah, I want to know who is sexist because I don't want to give them money. I mean, I think that if you care, if you are concerned that there are sexist or racist or homophobic people out there, you need to know who they are. Because if they're not allowed to discriminate, then what they're going to do is just find an excuse not to hire those people. So instead of them saying, I'm not hiring you because I'm a misogynist and I hate women, they're going to say, well, I'm not going to hire you because you're not qualified. So you don't have, as a consumer, you don't have that necessary information to make a decision on who to support with your money.
So it would seem from the potential employee's perspective, that's also an added benefit in the sense that it would seem that those people would be more able to seek out and be successful in their own vocations and professions, because if they are, or if you're exposing, hypothetically at least, exposing these kinds of prejudices, then, and if you're able to avoid people who are secretly racist or sexist, but they're always finding loopholes and cracks to wiggle through and say, right, I'm not hiring you because you're not qualified, they'll be able to avoid those people, and therefore they'll be much more successful because they'll gravitate towards businesses that will legitimately appreciate them.
Well, that's right. So look at it from this perspective as well, where let's say you own a widget factory and I own a widget factory, and I am, I hate gay people with a passion, and you love gay people. You don't care. You'll hire anybody who is qualified. So an applicant comes to me and they're highly qualified, they're well educated, and they're going to make me lots of money. But the problem is that this person is gay and I just don't like gay people. So I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to hire you because you're gay. So, he or she is going to go to your widget factory and say, look what I can do for you. And you say, perfect. So now I'm at a competitive disadvantage because I don't have that person's skills and talents. And, all of a sudden your widget factory is that much better in the marketplace than mine is.
Interesting. That almost reminds me in a kind of strange way of the Nazi book burning rallies, how they tried to purge out all kinds of, impure, in quotations, or Jewish references from their society. And there have been studies conducted about the kind of loss of intellectual inertia because of that, because they're saying, look, we don't want to deal with the stuff that comes from these people. It's much in the same way, a different level, of course, but it's very similar, I think, for that business that discriminates against those people. They're automatically going to then push away entire sets of people based on their gender or sexuality, and they're going to have a detriment to their business as a result of that.
Well, and I think that's right, and we see that now with the infamous gender wage gap, which has been proven false. I mean, I'm not even going to entertain that that's real. However, if let's say, again, going back to the example of we both own widget factories, and I only pay women whatever it is, 73, 76 cents an hour, and you're like, well, you're qualified as a woman, I'm going to pay you $1 an hour. Well, why would that highly qualified woman come and work for me? They're going to come and work for you. So again, I'm at a competitive disadvantage.
Right, right. So I see three main possibilities here. There's maybe more, but if the market forces are regulating this and you have no discrimination laws, I see either businesses are going to change their trends to meet the demands of society, the market demands, which arguably I think most businesses are doing voluntarily today. We see a lot of acceptance of LGBT in business policy and in marketing. Or they will go bankrupt. That's another possibility. Or they could also provide a kind of a peaceful coexistence, hopefully. Maybe this is a little bit positive in my thinking. But if we have separate groups that perhaps don't hate each other but don't get along, if you have businesses that can serve those groups separately and, dare I say, they self-segregate to a degree, that may actually provide a release on social tensions. So, for instance, I see a lot of emphasis today, especially in politics, of this dichotomous thinking. You must be this way or the other. There's no in between. Either you're fully on board with gay marriage or you're a homophobe. There's no in between on that. Civil unions or anything like that are out of the question. And I can see where there would be certain core values where one society, maybe a particularly religious community, just does not agree with the LGBT lifestyle, and in their personal community, that's their choice. And if they're not actually aggressing against those people, I don't see a particular problem with that. And in an LGBT community, they're not going to be especially... I would think that they wouldn't want to really mingle with people that don't get along with them. And that's something that's perplexed me about these issues is... especially with the wedding cake or pizza or any kind of food service, especially, I do not understand why you would want to force somebody to make you a product or give you a service. I would think that that would potentially affect the quality of that product or service, possibly in a detrimental fashion. And that also opens up the door, of course, to possible lawsuits and even fraudulent lawsuits based on discrimination. For instance, I think when you set the precedent that you have to serve everybody in a business, regardless of, for these anti-discrimination laws, and somebody comes in and they know that you have a history of not liking their particular group, they may have a legal standing to just bring false charges that you gave them a substandard product. And if the product is substantially expensive, it may be to their benefit to do that. But I think that there is a possibility, at least, again, thinking positively, that if we're talking about a group maybe of LGBTs that don't particularly get along with a particular group of Christians, if they go to different businesses that serve those two different communities, there could potentially, I would think, be less open tension about their situations because nobody's being forced against their will to serve people that they don't agree with. And of course, the LGBT restaurant owner would not have to serve the Christians or whatever group it may be either. And I think that when we get to a situation where we're forcing people constantly, you must get on board with this way of thinking, or you must get on board with that way of thinking, people don't generally go on board with it. They don't generally truly accept it. They become resentful, and I think that resentment can sometimes fester over a long period of time and actually cause more tension in society. And that may be just of course, it's just my opinion on the matter, but I think that's another aspect that we could possibly bring to the table here.
Right. If you want somebody to accept your lifestyle, the appropriate way to do it is to not force them to like your lifestyle, because that will, as you said, foster resentment. So, but I think we do see social trends changing, and the market does reflect that. You know, it was back in 2003, I believe, 2004, most of the companies on the Fortune 500 company list had adjusted their policies that they would not have discrimination in their workplace based on based on sexual orientation, and that had already included race and gender prior to that. So this was well ahead of the curve in terms of there was no pressure from Congress, at least overt pressure. So, I mean, that's what their customers want. So and that's what their employees want. So they're adjusting their policies to accept that. So I know an objection might be, well, what if every provider of a good or service in a given location, hates gay people and won't hire them and won't sell to them? Well, that's the great thing about a free market, is that there's no artificial barriers to entry. So there's nothing stopping, say, a gay person starting their own business to provide that service. What a great entrepreneurial opportunity. I mean, hey, what a way to make money. So if you have all of this money out there waiting to be exchanged for a certain good or service, I'm going to take advantage of that. Even if I'm not gay, I'll say, hey, I'll start this business and you guys can give me all of your money. I mean, that's a great thing. But right now, because we don't have that free market, it's very difficult to start a business. It's very difficult to get into business. So you have that check as well of if everybody in a given location does not do what you want them to do, you can go out and start your own business.
I think that's another good point to bring up, and just thinking about it through the course of this conversation, I think one of the best points brought up is going back to this idea of exposing the prejudice. In other words, if you have this free market system, people are free to essentially, or more free to express their prejudices, and may even do so openly to try to corner certain niche markets. But by doing the opposite, by forcing through law people to serve or produce for whomever, there seems to create this possible undercurrent of resentment. Now, things are changing in society, becoming certainly much more accepting, but in certain communities, I wonder if these laws could create some kind of a blowback, because a lot of political and social undercurrents really aren't felt until there's a catalyst for them. And I think that's one of the things, not to digress onto it, but one of the reasons why we've seen the rise of Donald Trump is because nobody was really aware of the undercurrent that was going on in the center and right in the United States political arena. And I wonder if these anti-discrimination laws may, in the long run, actually harm the LGBT community.
I think that's an astute point as well. I think from the LGBT standpoint, that sort of. I'm not sure what it is, but it could be that their what they feel their rights, you know, have been oppressed for so long by, say, Christians that they're going to sort of want to do it twofold back to them. And so you have this never ending struggle of who's going to get better on somebody else. And, is forcing a Christian to perform a service to somebody that they find to be against their religion, is that building acceptance in that religious person, or is that building tolerance? You know, is it tolerant to say you have to serve me or else? I mean, I was under the impression that tolerance was an acceptance of different ideas. But I'm glad you brought up Donald Trump because, as a person who spent his entire life in the marketplace, he saw an opportunity in the marketplace of ideas and capitalized on that, which is why he is as popular as he is, because he had, millions of voters felt like they weren't represented. So he came in and served, in a political metaphor, he served them the service that they demanded with their vote instead of their dollar.
Right, very true. So, and essentially, you were talking before that about the political pendulum. Something that a lot of people who don't study history, a lot of people don't realize is that when you see social trends that do not incorporate integration and assimilation into them, tend to have that blowback, that pendulum, where we see moving back and forth from radical right to radical left, or to right of center and left of center. And the reason for this oftentimes, I think, is because of the undercurrent of resentment that people are unaware of. And that just goes to show how, I think, misinformed and ill-educated so many people in society generally are, is that they are willfully or otherwise ignorant of other people's opinions and values and tend to just disregard them.
Well, and I think that's correct, and especially as far as people who identify as gay or lesbian, it's 3% of the population. As far as people who identify as transgender, it's less than 1%. It's like 0.3 of the population. So when you have such a small group of people who are using, basically the force of the state to, I mean, you can't force acceptance because it will have blowback, as you said. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wanted to clarify, excuse me, that although their LGBT group is, excuse me, rather small in society, there are a lot of people who have friends and relatives that are LGBT, and they certainly have widespread support in the general population. So I just want to clarify that I don't think either one of us is in any way suggesting that they should be discriminated against. I'm coming from the perspective of trying to have greater empowerment and self-responsibility and equal treatment, essentially. But just for anybody who thinks that it's ambiguous in any way, I do want to clarify that.
Well, sure, and that's certainly. I mean, everybody has somebody. It's like cancer. Everybody knows somebody who's been affected.
It's a very poor analogy.
Yeah, yeah, you like that. So, but no, that's true. And as a business owner myself, I don't care who you are or what you do in your free time. If you're willing to give me your money, I will happily accept it. And I think that's true for most business owners. I just think that there's a minority of business owners that don't, right or wrong, they feel that they do not want to give certain people their services. But I think that an interesting. Speaking of blowback, Target actually recently announced, and this was after the North Carolina law was passed, that in all of their stores nationwide, that their bathrooms would be, basically there would not be a male and female bathroom. Right now, as of this recording, if you go into Target and you're male, you can walk into the female bathroom and just, do whatever you want to do in there, and vice versa for females. And as a result, there is a boycott of Target. And it's, as of this recording, it's over $1.5 billion lost by the company as far as stocks because of that boycott. So, you do have an attitude of acceptance, but at the same time, when it comes to the bathroom issue, I think there's more. People like to paint it as, an issue of not accepting transgender people, but there is blowback from the standpoint of, is it safe for, people of the opposite sex to go in, whatever is it safe for men to go into the women's bathroom and vice versa? But the problem is we don't know because there's all these anti-discrimination laws. The only way we would know for sure is to let the market work itself. Because if it is safe, then companies will and businesses will allow you to do that. If it is not safe, they will not allow their customers to do that. Otherwise, they will risk losing business.
Right. I think that my personal idea, from a business perspective at least, regarding that would be to create a third gender bathroom. If I had a business, I think that I would create a third gender bathroom, or possibly two. But I do believe that the reason why the bathroom issue is so contentious, and the reason why Target's suffering as a result of this, is because there's a difference between, as you say, tolerance, accepting other people, and embracing that kind of perspective, embracing that lifestyle. And the bathroom is a very personal place. It's a very, people already feel, when you go to use a public restroom, people already feel a degree of concern about perhaps germs or creeps, weirdos that may be there, and adding this gender ambiguity to the bathroom system for a lot of people makes them feel very unsafe. It's a very personal place, and it feels invasive to imagine. And I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination. Obviously, the average trans person is not going to cause any problems in either bathroom that they choose to use. It's not an issue of that. But I think you can make a very rational argument that there will be people who abuse this system to essentially creep on people. There will be weirdos. There are already weirdos that use bathrooms in this way. I think that I can, not to sound weird, but I can see some weird guy kind of just putting on a wig and walking into the women's restroom to gawk. And I think that especially when children are involved, this could be a potential issue where there is some degree of concern. And I can understand. It's not something that I personally worry about. I don't think it's a major social issue, but I can see how it struck a nerve with people in that regard.
Well, sure. And I think in the case of, well, actually, I know in the case of Target, where it's not even that, you need to look transgendered. I mean, right now, I could go to Target and walk into the women's restroom, and I don't even have to identify as a female. I mean, and I think that's the concern among people, especially people with kids. And I think that you're going to see is it the responsibility of the U.S. court system or local court systems to determine what is transgendered and who? Because if I walk into any business and say, well, I identify as a woman, and I don't change my appearance, I don't put on a wig, I don't put on makeup, I just say I identify as a woman, am I transgendered? And the problem is that this isn't the responsibility of the court system to figure out. But I am glad you brought up the safety issue, and I don't think it's just about safety, though. And again, just for clarification, there's not a lot of examples of this causing safety issues. I don't think that's a concern at this point, but there will be abuse, I think, especially now that it has become more mainstream. But it's tough for parents, because if they are in there with their small child, and they see, let's say, a mother takes her, small child, male or female, into the restroom, and there's clearly a man in there wearing a wig and doing whatever he's doing, she's going to have to explain what that means. And a lot of parents feel like it's not, especially for maybe a 3, 4, 5, 6 year old, that it's not an appropriate age for them to start learning about gender and the differences, because they see that as taking away from, childhood.
Okay, I could see that. That's not something that I personally considered, but I could see that as being another point that especially perhaps more traditional families would certainly be concerned with. And I think you brought up an even better point as well about essentially how would Target or business X, any kind of business, how would they discriminate against people going into the bathroom that shouldn't be there? Unless they break a law or break some kind of a company policy, you're right. I mean, I should be able to, and I identify as a male, so I should be able to walk into Target and go into the women's bathroom just dressed in normal male-oriented clothing, and technically they shouldn't be able to tell me, or they would have no right, according to their own policy, to tell me to leave. So if they do, then that's another form of discrimination, and they're kind of destroying their own policies. So you get into a very strange ground, a very strange area, and it is quite a complicated issue when you try to implement it. For work, I had a long meeting, a very major meeting with quite a number of people from the organization, and it was considered very important, and a good portion of that meeting was discussing what to do about transgender people in bathrooms. And I personally think that there are much more important issues that that should be addressed in society, but these are, again, when you're talking about issues like this, how does it get addressed without stepping on somebody's toes? And I think that you do present a good case for the free market in this realm, because it allows businesses to essentially experiment with what the market wants, and clear policy winners will probably come forward from that. And I really think that, honestly, a third gender bathroom would probably be one of those solutions that will work. One thing that I would like to bring up that may be a criticism somebody may be thinking is the free market seems to work in these instances, and we're talking about, small scale or not very serious discrimination issues. But what about if we look at a potential society, a hypothetical society, that becomes arguably sexist, perhaps sexist or discriminatory against sexual minorities, where we have a large portion of the population who are openly sexist, who are hostile towards people of a transgender persuasion or a certain sexual minorities? How would the free market handle a situation like that?
Well, that's a great question. I think, first of all, it's unlikely that that would be the scenario based on the progress that our society has made in terms of, say, gender relations. But for the sake of argument, it goes back to what I said earlier. Let's say you and I were the only, widget makers in a town, and let's say, we both hated women, or we both hated gay people, and we wouldn't hire them. Well, let's take that up to a more national level, and all of a sudden, 80% of the population is now sexist, whatever that means. And I say that because, there's a lot of different ways you could interpret that term. But let's say that 80% of the population hates women, and I don't know how that would work considering women make up half the population, but let's just say 80% of the population. So that presents a great opportunity for somebody to come into the marketplace and serve an unserved market. So in a truly free market, there are no barriers to entry. So whether it's a restaurant or a widget maker or whatever, somebody can come in, an entrepreneur can come in with the investment money of all these people who want women to be served or gay people to be served and have a, that therefore they can get their goods and services. Look at the, it was in, what was it, Washington or Oregon a couple of years ago. There was a situation similar with the cake bakers, but it was with a wedding photographer, and that made a lot of news. And there were a lot of wedding photographers who said, "Yeah, I'll gladly take your picture. Just come to me." And of course, they didn't. They wanted to make a political statement. But I think it's a little, especially now, it's a little. I don't know how accurate it is to say that there won't be people who would be willing to provide a good or service. And if there's not, then that's a great economic opportunity for somebody who wants to make some money.
Okay, so essentially, if there's no opportunity there for employment, you can self-employ, you can start your own business, you can take people who've been marginalized and form a contract with them, and you will have an advantage because they're persecuted, so they will feel a greater loyalty towards your company. They'll probably work harder, etc.
Well, that's true, and people, the stereotype of, just for instance, Jewish people is that they're good at banking and they're good with money, and that's sort of like that's the stereotype. Well, it is based in truth, in a sense of when they were not allowed to do anything really, they had to start their own banks. They had to start their own investment services to support each other in the community, and they sort of their culture and religion evolved out of that, and now you have them as some of the leading people in the economy and the market because they did get that experience. And so they still are a minority in the world, but they made the best of it, and I think they're thriving as a culture.
Now that's very interesting to bring up as well, because there you're talking about a case example where you see discrimination actually leading to innovation being implemented into the cultural value system, leading to long-term cultural success. So that's an interesting point to bring up. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention about this issue and the free market and how they relate together?
No, I think we covered it. I think we covered it pretty well. I think that people, like I said, going back to one of the first things we talked about, is people have a misconception about what the free market is, and the free market is simply a marketplace without restriction by government. And it's important to note that restrictions often mean that one business is losing at the expense of another. So for every business that is being regulated, there's another business that's being subsidized by the government. So I just want to stress that we don't have a free market. We don't even have close to a free market right now, and it's difficult for people to understand the power of how consumers can regulate themselves, regulate companies, regulate the culture of the economy, the culture of business, just by voting with their dollar. But the government comes in and obscures that with regulations and taxes. So
I believe
it's
what you're hinting at there is essentially a system of corporatocracy, and that's something that I'd like to touch on properly in another video sometime.
Oh, I'd love to. Maybe that'll be our next one. But I think that's, yes, just if I can have anybody take away one thing, it's that we don't have a free market right now, but we did see what a free market can do in the 1800s, and there are checks and balances that we saw then that we can see in the future.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for taking the time to do that research and to come on to just share your experiences and your theories, your evidence with me, with our listeners, with the channel in general.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I hope we can provide some trigger warnings before the video, so just in case.
Yeah, I'm sure that some of my upcoming videos will definitely require trigger warnings.
Right. I don't want to inadvertently launch any therapy sessions for anybody. So get your safe space ready for the following videos on this channel.
This is a free thought space, so I don't care about the safety. All right, well, thank you to everybody out there. Thank you for listening. The sources used for this conversation can be found in the description, and if you have a better argument, please post it in the comments below. Thank you.